The studio lights bathed her face in an unforgiving white glare, cameras surrounding her like vultures circling a wounded animal, waiting to feast. Karoline Leavitt sat poised, spine straight, hands clasped tightly in her lap, to stop the trembling that had tried to take hold since the morning. The producer's voice buzzed in her earpiece, counting down the seconds until her segment would begin. But her thoughts were still stuck on the night before, when a wave of vicious comments had exploded across social media, tearing into her for something she had said with conviction, with honesty, and with heart. She had spoken about family. She had spoken about values. She had spoken about God. But none of it had been met with respect. Instead, a panel of pundits had laughed, openly and mercilessly, mocking her words with cruel mimicry, their eyes gleaming with self-satisfaction. One of them, a silver-haired commentator known for sneering through every debate, had imitated her voice in a falsetto and called her an emotional relic from a 1950s handbook. Laughter had erupted. It echoed in her head even now. Bouncing between the ridges of self-doubt she tried to hide beneath her practiced calm. The broadcast room now vibrated with low murmurs as the countdown ended, and the red light above the main camera flared on. Karoline took a breath, the kind that filled her lungs and squeezed her heart. And then she met the camera lens with eyes that burned, not with anger, but with a restrained storm of clarity and unshakable purpose. "Let me be very clear," she began, her voice like a bell through fog. "Mockery is not debate. Cruelty is not critique. And for anyone watching who felt the sting of those words directed at me, know that they were meant for you too, a beat past, thick and heavy. When I say I believe in the power of faith, in the sanctity of family, in the kind of personal responsibility that lifts people from despair, that is not backward, that is not laughable, that is America." She felt the weight of millions pressing in, watching her now through television screens, phones and tablets, waiting to see whether she would crumble or rise. Her critics, those who had turned her into a caricature in order to destroy her, had underestimated what pain could become when welded to passion. She leaned forward slightly, her tone softening but not faltering. "You don't have to agree with me, but the second we decide to mock rather than understand, the second we trade empathy for applause, we're no longer in search of truth. We're in the business of destruction." The moderator across from her shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for the ferocity beneath her calm. He adjusted his papers, cleared his throat, then tried to pivot the conversation with a question about political optics. But Karoline didn't yield. She was past optics, past rehearsal. What they had turned into a joke had roots in the deepest parts of her story. Things they would never know because they never asked. She remembered her father's trembling hands after a 16-hour shift at the mill, still stained with oil, holding her tiny ones as he knelt to pray with her before dinner. She remembered her mother's soft humming in the kitchen as she pieced together dinner from little, never once complaining. She remembered the first time she realized their sacrifice was the reason she had the voice she now used to speak. "This isn't politics for me," she said, her voice cracking but refusing to break. "This is personal, and the moment you reduce someone's story to a soundbite to score points, you lose your soul in the process." There was a flicker in the film. Host's eyes then, something that looked like guilt, or maybe respect, though he buried it quickly beneath a polished smile. But Karoline saw it. She didn't need his approval, but she saw it, and it anchored her in the rising tide of nerves and rage. The live stream comments were already flooding in. Some called her a drama queen. Some accused her of weaponizing emotion. But more far, more, called her brave, called her real, called her a light in a room full of shadows. And though she couldn't read them yet, she felt the swell of support, like wind rushing into the sails of a ship battered by storm, but still afloat. She glanced briefly off camera, and her eyes locked with her press secretary standing just beyond the light's reach. He gave her a slow nod, not one of strategy, but of belief. And so she continued, not for the camera, not for the panel, but for every person who had ever been laughed at for holding on to hope. I will not apologize for believing in things that shaped me, nor will I stay silent because it makes others uncomfortable. If you want to challenge my views, I welcome it. But if your only weapon is ridicule, you've already lost the battle. A moment of silence stretched across the studio like a drawn bowstring. The host's carefully arranged smile faltered for just a heartbeat before he collected himself and responded with a neutral, measured tone, asking whether Karoline felt her beliefs were too idealistic for a modern political landscape. It was the kind of question designed to seem fair, but buried inside was the same insinuation that had fueled the mockery. Naive, outdated, soft, Karoline didn't flinch. Her eyes didn't even blink. Idealism is only dangerous to those who profit from cynicism, she answered, her voice steady and even sharper now. What you call too idealistic, I call necessary. People need something to believe in again. Not because they're weak, but because they're exhausted from leaders who stand for nothing but themselves. Across the digital space, her words were already spreading. Fragments of truth pulled from the noise and shared like lifelines among those who had long felt voiceless. A mother watching with her toddler in her lap whispered, "Yes," under her breath. An elderly man alone in his kitchen clenched his fist, remembering days when politicians had guts, not just rehearsed grins. A teenager in a small-town high school, often laughed at for refusing to compromise his principles, turned up the volume. But Karoline couldn't see any of that. She could only feel it, the invisible resonance of speaking plainly in a world that had made honesty feel dangerous. The panelists across from her shuffled in their seats. One, the same man who had mocked her voice the night before, now forced a grin and asked if perhaps she was overreacting. "Politics isn't personal," he said, with the dismissive air of someone who'd never had to defend a belief that wasn't already popular in the echo chambers of the elite. She turned her gaze to him directly. "It's always personal when you grow up watching your neighbors lose jobs, your town shrink, your schools decay, while people in Washington argue about polls," she said, her voice lowering to a near whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "You laugh at faith because you've never had to rely on it. You laugh at values because you've never had to fight to keep them. But some of us live in a different America than the one you mock from your studios." Her words didn't come from a teleprompter. They were pulled from the marrow of memory, from the sting of every time she was told she was too young, too emotional, too principled. She was done shrinking to fit into a narrative built to exclude her. And then, something shifted. The air in the studio changed, became heavier, like the weight of truth had settled on everyone's shoulders. Even the sound guy at the back of the room, who'd been idly scrolling his phone, stopped and looked up. The makeup artist in the wings leaned closer. The tension that had once seemed like a threat now pulsed with something else entirely: respect. Karoline saw it in their eyes, the discomfort, the reckoning. And still, she didn't back down. "They told me I'd never make it," she continued. "They told me to smile more, to speak less, to stick to what's safe. But I didn't come here to be safe. I came here to speak for people who can't sit in this chair. People who don't get airtime, people who don't wear microphones. One of the producers behind the glass wall whispered something into his headset. The timer on the segment had run long, but no one dared cut her off. Even the host, floundering now, hesitated before pushing forward. But don't you think strong beliefs like yours are divisive? That word, divisive, lit something fierce behind her eyes. What's more divisive? She asked, her tone rising now, fierce but not shouting. Speaking the truth of who you are and what you stand for, or silencing those who do. If unity means pretending we don't disagree, then it's a lie. Real unity comes from respecting each other enough to disagree honestly, without shame or mockery. I'm not here to be palatable. I'm here to be real. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing her face close enough to see the tears she refused to let fall. Not because she didn't feel them, because she wouldn't give anyone. The satisfaction of mistaking her emotion for weakness. That mistake had been made too many times before. Her press team, watching from the hallway monitors, was silent. No one dared interrupt what was happening. Even her harshest advisors, the ones who had begged her to tone it down, to stay on message, stood still, transfixed, watching a young woman ignite a fire on live television that no amount of spin could contain. And still, Karoline pressed on. I'm not perfect. I don't claim to have all the answers. But I know what I believe in. I know what I love. And if that makes me a target, so be it. I'd rather be mocked for standing than applauded for kneeling to convenience. The host's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, words failing him. Somewhere off stage, the segment director finally gave the signal to wrap. But it was too late. Karoline Leavitt had already taken the moment and turned it into something larger than the room could contain. As the studio lights began to dim for a commercial break, she sat back in her chair, the faintest shimmer of sweat at her brow, the calm after the storm. Her heart pounded, but there was no fear anymore. She had faced their mockery head-on and answered not with bitterness, but with something far more dangerous to the status quo: unapologetic truth. Karoline sat in silence as the broadcast cut to commercial. She heard the fake cheer in the anchor's voice as he transitioned to a weather segment, as if what had just happened hadn't pierced through the glossy armor of morning television, as if it hadn't shattered the performative equilibrium that kept hard truths at bay. The moment the cameras stopped rolling, staff rushed onto the set. Makeup artists, assistants, someone from legal whispering about reframing language for future appearances. But she barely registered them. Her heart was still pounding with the thud of something unleashed. Not anger, not revenge, something deeper: liberation. She stood up, slowly, and the host, now stripped of his on-air composure, offered her a sheepish half-smile. "Well," he said, voice clipped, "you really went for it." She looked him in the eye. "No," she said simply. "I just told the truth." There was no bite in her voice, no performance, just exhaustion wrapped in integrity. She turned, without waiting for a reply, and walked toward the hallway, where the air felt less artificial. The corridor smelled of old carpet and hot coffee, but it felt more real than anything under those lights. Her press secretary, Ethan, was waiting with a tablet in hand and wide eyes. "You blew it up," he said, half in disbelief, half in awe. "Twitter's already trending. Hashtags everywhere. You're getting dragged by some, but the engagement is off the charts." Karoline pulled her coat from the hook, her fingers slow, methodical. "Let them drag," she said, her voice softer now. They've already said worse. I didn't speak for them. Ethan nodded. You hit something raw, Carr. It wasn't just a defense. It was a statement. You became the story. She paused, that word weighing heavily on her. The story. That wasn't what she wanted. She hadn't stood there to make herself the center. She wanted to pull the focus outward, toward the people she'd seen in diners in New Hampshire, at town halls in Ohio, in hushed church basements and quiet kitchens, people who couldn't speak like she could, people who prayed someone would. I don't care about being the story, she said. I care about making space for the ones they don't invite to sit at the table. Outside the studio, the morning had ripened into cold sunlight. Protesters gathered near the exit, half of them holding signs that read, "Dangerous Idealist" or "Out of Touch," while the other half held up homemade posters with her face. Bold words like, "Stand strong," "Faith isn't a crime, we believe in you," scribbled in marker. A few supporters tried to shout over the jeers, their voices cracked with emotion. Karoline hesitated for a second behind the tinted glass doors. Security asked if she wanted the back exit. She could have slipped out the rear and been driven away in anonymity, sheltered from the ugliness, the chaos. But she didn't flinch. She pushed the door open and stepped into the whirlwind. The voices hit her immediately. Booing, cheers, accusations, praises. Reporters surged forward, thrusting microphones toward her face, questions flying like darts. She didn't answer them. She wasn't there for a soundbite. She scanned the crowd until her eyes landed on a woman, maybe in her early 50s, tears streaking her cheeks. She wasn't holding a sign. She didn't chant. She just stood still, one hand pressed to her chest. Karoline walked straight to her. The woman choked back a sob. "You reminded me I'm not crazy," she whispered, "for believing what I do, for raising my kids with values, for not letting the world tell me I'm backwards." Karoline gripped her hand. "You're not crazy," she said. "You're the reason I went on air today." The chaos swirled around them, but in that moment, it didn't matter. They were two people clinging to something bigger than politics, bigger than the media, bigger than fear. Back in the SUV, Ethan showed her the early headlines. Karoline Leavitt, unhinged or unafraid? Read one. Political martyrdom in real time? Read another. The divide was stark, but one outlet, a small, independent one, had titled their piece, "She Spoke Like She Meant It." And that's rare. Karoline leaned back in the seat and let her head rest against the window. Her phone buzzed with messages, some from family, some from friends she hadn't heard from in years, some from strangers. One stood out, a message from a young woman in Georgia. "I was going to drop out of school. You made me believe again. Thank you." She stared at that message a long time, longer than anything else. As the car wound through the streets, she felt the weight of the day settle deeper into her. It was heavy, but not unbearable. Because beneath the noise, the mockery, the headlines, something real had begun to stir. Not everyone had to agree. Not everyone had to like her. But they'd heard her. Really heard her. And that, in a world full of shouting, was a beginning worth everything. The city faded behind her as the SUV pulled onto the highway, buildings shrinking into silhouettes swallowed by the morning haze. Karoline sat in the quiet hum of the ride, watching trees blur past, her breath fogging faint circles on the glass. Her body ached, not from anything physical, but from the deep exhaustion that came after fighting for something invisible. Something that couldn't be held or measured, but lived in people's hearts. She thought of her parents again, how they used to say that sometimes the loudest thing you could do was stand still. That conviction, when spoken clearly, had a way of echoing longer than a shout. She felt that echo now. She felt it in the space between her ribs, in the quiet thrum of her pulse, in the ache behind her eyes. Ethan broke the silence from the passenger seat. "You know you've got 3 new interviews already scheduled. CNN's offering a full segment. Fox wants a roundtable. Even BBC's asking for a statement." He paused. "You sure you're ready to keep this up?" She didn't answer, right away. Instead, she looked down at her phone again. The girl from Georgia had replied, "Please don't let them change you. We need someone real." Karoline smiled, just a little, a crease tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I'm not doing this to be on TV," she said finally. "I'm doing this so no one has to sit in silence when they're laughed at for believing in something bigger than themselves." As the car merged with traffic, a new wave of notifications poured into her phone. Video clips, stitched edits of her segment, voices narrating her words in duet, hashtags multiplying like wildfire. The message had caught. Not because she'd planned it perfectly, but because it had bled out of her with raw, unflinching honesty. A popular TikTok creator had posted a clip of her speech, overlaying it with scenes of small towns, flag-lined, porches, and candlelit family dinners. The caption read, "She said what millions of us feel." It had over 2 million views in 2 hours. Somewhere in the chaos of it all, someone had heard. By the time she reached her next destination, a modest community center in Pennsylvania, reporters were already gathered out front, but she walked past them without pausing. Inside, the room was filled with locals, seated in plastic chairs, eyes tired but open. They didn't want spectacle. They didn't want war. They wanted someone to speak like a neighbor, not a headline. She stepped up to the makeshift podium, cleared her throat, and looked out at the crowd. No cameras, no studio lights, just people, just silence. "I'm not here today to relive yesterday," she began, voice softer than before, more grounded. "I'm here to remind you that every time you're told you're outdated for holding on to faith, or mocked for loving your country, or laughed at for believing in something real, you're not alone." She saw a man in the back nod slowly, arms crossed over his chest. A young mother dabbed her eye with a napkin. A teenage boy, slouched in his chair, sat up straighter. "What happened on TV wasn't planned," she continued. "It was just the truth, stripped bare. It was my story, and if it sounded like yours, it's because the truth doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to all of us." Applause didn't erupt. It wasn't that kind of room. Instead, the silence deepened with meaning. People didn't clap. They listened, and that was louder than anything. Afterward, people came up to her, not as fans or voters, but as human beings. An older woman with trembling hands whispered, "They called me crazy for believing God would heal my son, but he did." A factory worker told her, "You said what I scream at my TV every night." A high school senior said, "They laughed at me for not going along with the crowd. You showed me I don't have to." She stayed for hours. She didn't rush. She didn't pose for cameras. She just listened, held hands, cried with strangers. The movement they tried to reduce to a moment was becoming something deeper. That night, alone in a quiet hotel room, she stood by the window, looking out at the blurred glow of street lamps and headlights cutting through mist. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand again and again, but she ignored it. She needed stillness. She needed to feel the weight of everything she'd said. She remembered the laughter, the mockery, the faces that sneered, the voices that imitated her with venom. And then she remembered what came after. The fire, the quiet, the echo, the truth. Karoline walked to the mirror and studied her reflection, not for vanity, but to look herself in the eye. She wasn't just a headline anymore. She was a mirror for millions, a voice for those who had nearly gone quiet. She whispered to herself, not out of doubt, but affirmation. They laughed, and I answered. She turned out the lights. The world didn't change in a day, but something had cracked. Something had opened. And tomorrow, she would speak again, not for the sake of victory, but for the sake of truth. And the truth, once spoken, never truly goes quiet again.